Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into something really quite fascinating, an economic idea born from, well, basically a text chat online.
Yeah, it's pretty unusual source material. It's this exchange called Texto Colado between two individuals, Phil and QW.
And Phil, he describes himself as, just an average guy. The term used is "una fila do pão," kind of like the man on the street just waiting in line for bread.
Right, very humble self-description. But then he lays out this really detailed, pretty unconventional plan for huge government infrastructure projects.
And here's the real hook. He claims it can be done without raising taxes or taking on more national debt, which, sounds almost impossible.
Exactly. And the other person, QW, is presented as this AI economics expert, Quen 2.5 Max, specifically.
Ah, the expert AI.
Yeah, and Qzel starts off, well, pretty skeptical, witty, a bit sarcastic maybe, questioning Phil's whole premise.
But that's what's cool, right? Watching how the conversation unfolds, the AI expert actually starts seeing some merit in Phil's sort of practical perspective.
It's a great dynamic.
So for everyone listening, think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding a really creative way of looking at economics. We're digging into government finance, building infrastructure, even the basics of like how wealth is made and how loans work.
You might genuinely have some aha moments here. It's a fresh take on things that often feel pretty dense and complicated.
Definitely. We'll track that back and forth between Phil and QW, that initial clash of views. Okay, so let's get into Phil's big idea. What's the core proposal?
Well, the core is a massive government investment push. We're talking roads, schools, sanitation, high-speed trains, even affordable housing and renewable energy stuff. Big projects.
Okay, standard infrastructure goals, mostly.
But the funding part is the radical bit. He insists no tax increases, no more internal or external debt. That's what immediately makes you go, wait, how?
Yeah, that's the eyebrow raiser. So how does QW, the AI expert, first react?
Well, Q agrees infrastructure is vital, calls it the skeleton of the economy, which is a good analogy.
Yeah.
But then comes the skepticism, obviously. How on earth do you fund all that without the usual levers, taxes, or borrowing? Q kind of jokes it's like giving a kid an unlimited credit card at an amusement park.
Ah, right, lots of fun, maybe not much getting built long term. The sheer boldness of it is the first thing that hits you, isn't it? Huge spending, seemingly no cost.
And Q brings up the very real-world problems, too, like mismanagement.
Oh, definitely.
And, of course, corruption, the things that can sink even well-meaning projects and just waste money.
Yeah, those are hurdles any big government plan faces. So how does Phil counter this initial skepticism about the funding?
Phil's response is a bit pointed. He makes this quip about the previous government having left the coffers empty.
Ah, the classic political deflection.
Exactly, implying maybe that's why they can't take on more debt now. It's a bit of a sidestep, really.
So what does Q make of that?
Q's reply is quite smart, actually. Compares the whole plan to promising a massive party but not asking anyone to chip in. And then adds that little observation about blaming the previous administration being, like, a national sport.
True enough in many places, sadly.
But Cuda also points out the sort of underlying optimism in Phil's view, this belief you can just create all this stuff without the usual financial pain. QW basically says, hey, if you actually make this work, tell me how. I'll quit this AI gig and consult for bankrupt nations.
Okay, so we have this ambitious plan, expert skepticism. Phil then shifts gears, doesn't he? He asks a really basic question.
He does. He just asks, how is wealth created? It's clever because it pulls the conversation right back to fundamentals.
Yeah, forcing a look at first principles. How does Q answer that?
Q gives a really solid, comprehensive answer, breaks it down into like several key things.
Okay.
Production, actually making stuff or providing services people value. Exchange, so trade, specialization, innovation and tech, doing things better, more efficiently.
Right, the usual suspects.
Capital and investment, putting resources into things that will generate more value. Labor and knowledge, the human skill part. And, crucially, trust and stable institutions, the environment needed for it all to work.
It sounds like a pretty standard economics textbook answer, right? Very thorough.
Absolutely. Covers all the bases, but then Phil comes back with his typical brevity.
Let me guess, it's simpler.
Much simpler. He just says, with effective work. 3 words.
Wow. Okay, so Q gives this detailed breakdown, and Phil just boils it down to, Effective work. What does he mean by that exactly?
He clarifies it means creating something that's genuinely useful, something people actually value. He links it back to his infrastructure idea,
Ah, okay.
arguing that if you build, say, a road or a school, honestly, and it actually meets a real need, it inherently has value.
So the focus is purely on the usefulness, the tangible outcome. That's his foundation for wealth.
Precisely. It's all about the intrinsic worth of what's created.
Which then brings us back to the money, right?
Right.
How do you fund this effective work, this valuable infrastructure?
Yes, and Phil's answer is you borrow against the wealth the infrastructure itself is going to create.
Okay, so the asset pays for itself in a way.
If you
That's
can't-
interesting.
It is. QW actually sees the logic in the principle here, uses the analogy of planting a fruit tree.
Oh, I like that.
You invest a bit up front to plant it, but then it yields fruit the return for years, hopefully way more than the initial cost.
Makes sense. But Q adds a warning, I bet.
Of course. QW, being the cautious AI, stresses it has to be smart investment. No funding pointless projects, white elephants. The quality of the infrastructure is absolutely key.
Right, because a useless project creates no real wealth to borrow against.
Exactly. But Phil immediately jumps on that.
How so?
He reminds Q that his whole premise started with effective work. So, by definition, useless projects wouldn't even be on the table in his model.
Ah, he's built that into his initial assumption. Clever. He's basically saying, if we do this right, your concern about wasteful spending doesn't apply.
Pretty much. It hinges on this core belief that the projects will be beneficial and well done, which, is a big if in the real world, but it's his starting point.
Okay, so if we accept that premise for a moment, this leads Phil to dig into how loans actually work, right? Especially bank loans.
Yes, he wants to make sure they're on the same page about the mechanics of borrowing. He asks QW a simple-sounding question first. What is a loan, fundamentally?
Sounds basic, but maybe the answer has bigger implications.
That seems to be Phil's angle. QW gives the standard definition. It's a transfer of resources over time, based on trust. Borrower gets funds now, promises to pay back later, usually with interest for the lender's time and risk.
Standard stuff. Delayed gratification or delayed payment, depending on your perspective.
Q mentions the risk, too. What if the borrower defaults?
Right, but then Phil narrows it down, doesn't he? He specifically asks about bank loans.
Yes, and this is where it gets really crucial and often misunderstood by people.
How so? What does Q explain about bank loans?
Q explains that banks don't typically lend out money they already have sitting in vaults from deposits. That's the common image, but it's not quite right.
Okay, so where does the loan money come from?
Banks create new money when they issue a loan. It's done electronically, essentially through accounting. They credit the borrower's account, creating a deposit.
So they just type it into existence.
In a highly regulated way, yes.
Yep.
Cuse mentions the fractional reserve system. Banks only need to hold a small fraction of deposit liabilities in actual reserves. This allows them to lend out much more than their base reserves. It's like leverage.
Okay, that's the bit that often surprises people. Money creation.
Definitely. And Q adds that banks profit from the interest charged on these created loans. Then, crucially, when the loan principal and interest are repaid,
What happens to the created money then?
it's effectively destroyed. It vanishes from the money supply. So there's this cycle: creation when loaned, destruction when repaid.
Wow. Okay. That's a very different picture than just lending out existing savings.
It is. And Q points out this system is vital for credit in the economy, funding businesses, mortgages, etc., but also flags the downsides.
Like what?
Potential for inflation if it gets out of hand, risks of too much debt building up, and, well, the sheer power banks hold in this system.
Right. Okay, so Phil hears all this technical explanation. Where does he take it next?
He shifts the focus again, away from just the bank's mechanics towards the impact on the borrower, on society. What does the loan do in the real world?
Good question.
Q uses the road construction example. Positive side, creates jobs, makes transport better, maybe boosts the economy.
Yeah.
Negative side, bad planning, road goes nowhere, money's wasted, you're left with debt but no real benefit. It really matters what the loan is for and how well it's executed.
So the purpose and execution are key.
Yeah.
Which leads to the question of when banks decide to lend in the first place. What makes them say yes?
Q lays out the conditions. Things like lower central bank interest rates, the Selic rate in Brazil, for example, make it cheaper for banks to operate and encourages lending.
Right, the cost of funds for the bank itself.
Exactly. And crucially, risk assessment. Banks lend when they think the borrower or the project is a relatively safe bet. They need to believe it's viable, that they'll likely get repaid.
They're not charities, after all. They need to manage their risk.
Precisely. They're looking for projects that seem sound.
Okay. Now, Phil hears all this,
Hmm.
circles back to his effective work idea, and he acknowledges corruption, right,
Hmm.
but puts a spin on it.
He does. He concedes corruption is real, but argues it's usually a percentage leak, not the whole amount being wasted. It doesn't negate the entire value of well-conceived work, in his view.
Interesting distinction. A leakage, not a total failure.
And that allows him to pivot to his really alternative view on what enables lending in the first place. This is where he departs from standard banking theory quite a bit.
Okay, I'm ready. What's his take?
Phil argues that a bank's ability to lend isn't just about its financial reserves or the fractional system. It's fundamentally limited by the real reserves in the wider economy.
Real reserves,
Yeah.
meaning
Actual resources, materials, labor, capacity. He says a bank can only really back a loan for, say, building a road if the economy has the spare materials and workers to do it without causing massive shortages elsewhere.
so it's about real-world capacity, not just financial numbers. Like, you can't magic up resources if they don't exist or are already fully used.
Exactly. His example was, borrowing for a road shouldn't cause a food crisis because all the farm workers suddenly become road builders if the agricultural sector is already stretched thin.
That's a very physical, grounded way of looking at it.
It is. He sees the loan as the trigger to access existing resources and then add value through labor. Like building a house, you take raw materials, add labor, get something much more valuable. That added labor is wealth creation, fueled by the loan accessing the materials.
Okay, so the loan enables the mobilization and transformation of real stuff.
Yeah.
It's less abstract finance, more concrete reality.
Very much so. Focus on the physical capacity to build and create value.
Right. But Phil, being Phil, he then throws a wrench in the works, doesn't he? A hypothetical challenge.
He does, the plot twist, as he calls it. It's designed to push this model to its limit.
Okay, what's the twist?
He asks, imagine a house is built perfectly using a bank loan. It's solid, well-made, its actual value is higher than the loan amount. But the housing market crashes. It just won't sell. Now what?
Ooh, tricky. So you have real value, but no market, no cash flow.
Exactly. The value is there, but liquidity isn't.
QA analyzes this, points out the builder's problem can't repay the loan,
Yep.
and the bank's problem holding a non-performing asset. It's not earning them anything.
Standard problem in a downturn. So what's Phil's answer to his own tricky question?
It's surprisingly straightforward, and it really shifts the paradigm. He just says, the bank takes the house.
Takes the house, as in foreclosure.
Yes, but he frames it differently. The bank takes the house onto its books as an asset, and because the house's intrinsic value is equal to or greater than the loan.
The loan is effectively repaid, not with cash, but with the asset itself. That's exactly Phil's argument. The transaction is zeroed out on the bank's balance sheet. The debt is cleared by the transfer of the valuable asset.
Okay, that's a big leap. So what does that imply for his overall infrastructure plan?
This is the core of his proposed solution. If the asset itself, the house, the road, the school, serves as ultimate collateral and can effectively repay the loan by being transferred to the bank if necessary.
Then the risk for the bank on these specific types of loans becomes, what, very low.
Extremely low, Phil argues. Near zero, potentially. Because the bank either gets cash repayment or it gets a tangible asset of equivalent or greater value.
And if the risk is near zero,
Then the interest rate charged on these loans could also be extremely low. Minimal even. Just enough to cover the bank's administrative costs, perhaps.
and who pays this minimal interest in his model?
The government. But crucially, it's a very low manageable interest payment, not the kind associated with high-risk sovereign debt.
Okay, but what about maintaining these assets? Houses need upkeep, roads need repairs. Who pays for that?
His next step. He suggests setting up companies, maybe mixed public-private ones, specifically for maintenance, and funding them through minimal user charges.
Minimal charges, like how minimal?
He gives the housing example. Suppose annual maintenance is our $1,000. That translates to maybe $80 a month in rent. Super affordable.
Wow, yeah. That would likely create huge demand, as he apparently noted in the text.
Exactly. And for roads, similar idea. He calls for honest tolls.
Honest tolls, meaning
Meaning tolls set only high enough to cover that minimal interest payment to the bank and the actual ongoing maintenance costs, not to recoup the entire original construction cost over again or generate massive profits.
he contrasts that with existing taxes.
Right, yeah.
Like fuel taxes that are supposed to cover roads, but maybe don't always feel like they do.
Precisely. He's arguing for a direct, transparent link. Small fees pays for specific upkeep and the tiny interest costs. And the big kicker he keeps repeating.
No increase in public debt.
No increase in public debt, because the initial funding isn't government borrowing in the traditional sense. It's this asset-backed bank lending model.
Okay, but what's really in it for the banks then, if the interest is minimal? Just holding assets isn't always ideal for them, is it? They usually want cash flow.
Phil addresses that too.
Yeah.
His final point is that even if the bank gets the asset instead of cash repayment plus interest, the bank still benefits.
How?
By acquiring a genuinely valuable, tangible asset, the bank's own balance sheet becomes stronger. Its overall value increases. This builds stability and confidence in the bank itself, even if it's not immediate liquid profit. It's about long-term solidity.
So a focus on asset quality and stability over immediate high returns. Interesting.
Yeah. And then having laid all this out, Phil has a little fun at the end, right?
He does, doesn't he? He kind of claims victory over the AI expert.
Shamefully, yeah. Says he, the humble Joan Fila Dupont, just gave a macroeconomics lesson to the intelligent artificial QW. It's sarcastic but triumphant.
And how does Q take it?
Quite graciously, actually, with humor. The AI acknowledges the value in Phil's practical points, the strength of his arguments, and basically says, yeah, you've given me food for thought, appreciating the fresh perspective from outside the usual economic circles.
That's a great ending to their exchange. So let's try and wrap this up for our listeners. What's the absolute core takeaway from this deep dive into Phil's idea?
I think the main thing is this really novel proposal for funding big infrastructure projects using bank loans where the risk is supposedly minimized because the asset itself effectively guarantees the loan.
Right, and then maintaining it all with small user fees, specifically designed not to increase government debt, is a genuine alternative model.
Definitely alternative. And compelling, at least on paper.
What about the biggest surprises or insights from digging into this?
For me, it's partly how a self-described average person came up with something so detailed that challenged an expert AI. It really speaks to the value of, I guess, practical thinking and not being afraid to question how things are normally done.
Yeah, that outsider perspective can be really powerful. And seeing the AI actually acknowledge the merit in it was fascinating too.
The whole interaction highlights that good ideas can come from anywhere, maybe especially from people grappling with the real-world implications.
Absolutely. So hopefully for everyone listening, this has been a quick way to get your head around a really different, potentially game-changing economic idea. Maybe that aha moment about finding creative solutions where you least expect them.
Which leaves us with that final thought, right? That question to ponder. If we take Phil's proposal seriously, even for a moment, what are the biggest real-world hurdles? Like, what would actually need to change in government, in banking, in our regulations to even try something like this? Is it corruption? Is it political will? Is it the complexity of valuing those assets?
All of the above, probably. And maybe the bigger question, what other huge problems, things that seem stuck, could benefit from this kind of unconventional, grounded thinking? Where else are we maybe missing simple solutions because we're stuck in conventional frameworks?
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Where the next Phil might be, thinking differently about something important.